Basic anatomy and physiology of the heart. Okay, so first of all, where is the heart? The heart is located in your thorax, and it's contrary to popular belief, it's not on one side of your thorax, namely the left side. It's actually right in the middle. So you have your two lungs, and your heart is right in the middle, beating all the time. This poses a problem. What would happen if the heart and the lungs were in direct contact? Then maybe the movement would be restricted because maybe the heart could be adhere to part of the lungs. So nature was very smart about this and did something about it. What did they do? They put a membrane in between them. So as you can see, the lungs have a membrane, which we'll later on know or learn is a pleura, and it also surrounded the heart with another membrane called the pericardium. So this allows movement between the two organs without any obstruction. Now let's talk about the chambers of the heart. From now on, I just want to point out that we're going to do a schematic of the heart, and it's not the actual anatomy or how it looks in real life. So we're going to look at the schematics and then relate it to the real life image in order to understand it easier. Okay? So first of all, we got to understand what's right and left. When I ask you to raise your right hand, you raise your right hand regardless the fact that I'm looking at you and that your right hand is actually to my left. So when we talk about the right and left part of something, of any part of somebody's body, it's their right and left. So we just got to take that into account. So for example, in this case, we're looking at the heart from the front of the person, and therefore what's to our left is actually their right side. Okay? So there's always going to be a right and left. And we have four chambers, as you can see here. So it's actually divided into right and left half and top and bottom half. The top are atriums. The bottom are ventricles. So it's very easy to name. It's the right atrium, left atrium, right ventricle, left ventricle. It's as easy as that. And how does blood flow through these chambers? Well, it comes from the body, enters the right atrium, then passes to the right ventricle. This blood then goes to the lungs, then it goes back to the heart, into the left atrium, then to the left ventricle, and then it goes back into the body. So there's something important to understand about this. The right side of your heart carries deoxygenated blood. This means that it's blood that went through your body, the oxygen was used by other systems and organs, and then goes through your heart, then to your lungs. So by the time it reaches your heart, it doesn't have as much oxygen as it did when it left the lungs. So the left side of your heart is the one that carries the blood or pushes the blood after it's been in the lungs. Okay? That's very important to understand for the next concept, because one of the next questions is um, how blood circulates through the system. So we basically have two types of major classifications for this. The first one is called the pulmonary circulation, which basically, as you can see in the image, is the circulation that goes between the heart and the lungs. So going back and forth, that's the circulation between the heart and the lungs. And then we have the systemic circulation, which is basically the blood that goes between your heart and the rest of your systems. As you can see, you have the top, which basically are made up of your limbs and head, and the bottom, which is made up of your abdomen and lower limbs. Okay? But something interesting about this is maybe a paradigm that we have since we were little that they taught us in elementary school or maybe junior high is what's an artery and what's a vein. As you can see here, this pulmonary artery is taking blood out of the heart and into the lungs. Then we have the pulmonary vein, which is taking blood from the lungs and into the heart. So if it's coming from the lungs and into the heart, it's carrying oxygenated blood. If it's coming out of the heart and into the lungs, carrying deoxygenated blood. So sometimes they told us, a blood vessel that carries deoxygenated blood is a vein, and a blood vessel that carries oxygenated blood is an artery. And that's not completely true because these are the exceptions. So in reality, the difference between a vein and an artery is that the arteries carry blood out of the heart, and veins carry blood into the heart, okay, or towards the heart. Now, obviously, there has to be a middle ground, and these middle grounds are capillaries, okay? These capillaries are made up of very, very thin blood vessels. In some cases, these capillaries are so thin that blood travels, or red blood cells travel one at a time in a single line. The reason for this is that since they're so thin, there can be an exchange of what's inside the cell with what's outside the cell. Namely, for example, if we're, I don't know, in the liver or any of the sort, the cells from the liver can take oxygen, for example, from the passing red blood cells in the capillaries and give back, for example, CO2. So that's just so that you understand why capillaries are so important, okay? And now that we understand which is which are arteries, which are veins, now we won't get confused with the next part. Something important to understand is how blood moves. So, as you can see here, we have a heart that pumps, okay? And that heart pumps uh, blood through through arteries. So therefore, they have a force behind them that's actually pushing the blood. Okay, that's easy to understand. But what happens in the case of the veins? I mean, once they've gone through the capillaries and through the organs, and there has been an exchange and everything, what happens? There is no pump per se that pushes the blood back to the heart. So how does this work? Well, first of all, we have to understand a concept called valve. Okay? So here, for example, in your heart, you have various valves. You have, actually here we can see four, and we're going to name them in a minute. But as you can see in this diagram, or this image, you can see how blood goes through in one direction through the valve, but doesn't go back. And that's very important because this gives one single direction to blood flow. Okay? So in the case of veins, you have valves, as you can see here, and the blood passes through towards the heart, but doesn't go back. Now, one of two things make this blood go through these valves. One can be gravity, and you can feel this when, for example, you raise your hand for a long time. Blood starts leaving your arm, and it can even cause you pain. But the other thing that can happen is the muscles around your body obviously cause pressure when they contract, and also help push this blood towards the heart again. So that's why when you're in a long trip, you sometimes feel like your legs are very heavy, or they can even start hurting, because since there's lack of movement, then you have an excess, let's say, of blood in your legs. Okay, so that's why, for example, in elderly people and long trips, they recommend they stand every once in a while to avoid blood clots, and avoid blood from not circulating around the veins. Now, let's go back to the schematic. We have the four chambers, okay? Now, what blood vessels, connect to these chambers? Remember, we have the oxygenated and deoxygenated side. And this doesn't mean they're changed the fact that they're arteries or veins. Remember that all blood vessels that take blood to the heart, regardless of the oxygenation, are veins. Okay? And veins that connect to, you're always going to have two veins that connect to each chamber of the heart. Okay? So, for example, in the right atrium, you have the superior, inferior, or lower and superior vena cava. On the left atrium, you have a right and left vein. And this is quite obvious when you think about it, because obviously, if the blood that reaches the right atrium is coming from the rest of your body, you have what's coming from the top of your body and what's coming from the bottom. So that's why you have a lower and superior vena cava. And pulmonary veins, well, you have a right and left lung. So they have to split up and come from back to the heart. So that's why you have a right and left pulmonary vein. Now, you also have blood vessels that go out of the heart, and these once again are called, remember, arteries. Okay, so these arteries have one has a simple name and one has a slightly more complicated name. Let's go with the simple first. The pulmonary vein, well, it says what it's doing. So remember, if we're on the right side, it's carrying deoxygenated blood and it has to go to the lungs. Therefore, it's called pulmonary. But once it went through the lungs, came back to the heart, to the right, through the left ventricle, then it goes to the rest of your body, and this is the not so easy name, which is aortic artery or the aorta. It's the biggest artery you have in all your body. Okay. Now, as I said before, your heart has valves. There's tons of valves in your heart, but we're going to learn the main ones. Okay. Why is it important, first of all, to have valves? Because valves push or help the blood go in one direction. If there weren't valves, each time the heart squeezed or contracted, then blood would go backwards and forwards, and that would be no good. So in order to avoid this, we have valves, okay? So let's start. On your left, you can see a top view of these valves, okay? And the point of showing you this is that you understand why they're named how they're named, okay? So the one that's between the right atrium and right ventricle is made up of three parts, as you can see here. That's why it's called tricuspid valve. And the one on the left between the left atrium and the left ventricle is made up of two parts. That's why it's called bicuspid. In some places you can also find it as mitral valve. Whichever one you prefer to learn is good. It's the names are right. Okay. Now, you also have to avoid the blood from leaving when you don't want it to. So you have to put like a lid on the bottom, and those lids are basically some more valves. And the names are quite easy to learn once you learn the parts of the heart and the blood vessels. So the valve that goes between the right ventricle and the pulmonary artery is called, you guessed it, pulmonary valve. Then you have the valve that goes between the left ventricle and the aortic artery, therefore it's called the aortic valve. So it's that simple. And this is basically how the blood flows through the heart. Okay? So if I would have shown you this image from the beginning, this would have been quite complicated to understand at first. But now that you understand this part, let's relate it to the heart. So, my first recommendation is that you find obvious parts to it. So, there's only one part of the human body, one part of the heart that receives blood from the bottom and from the top. Remember, the vena cava. So this is the most obvious structure to find first, and then just simply follow our path here and follow the path of the blood through our diagram. So the first part, as you can see, is the vena cava, the top and bottom, and they reach the right atrium. So obviously, the part they reach is the atrium. Okay? Then it has to pass through a valve. It's the tricuspid valve that goes between the right atrium and the right ventricle. those little parts there. Then you have it reaches the right ventricle. So the chamber that it reaches is the next part. Now, something to look at first before we go on is that this schematic doesn't show necessarily the right direction of the heart. Here, these two are pointing down, and as you can see here, there is no artery pointing down. And when you think about it, it's quite logical. What's the next step after the right ventricle? It has to go to the lungs. So your lungs are not under your heart, they're right next to it. So it goes up again and then splits up into two arteries. So the first artery where it comes out from is called, you already know it, the pulmonary artery. But first it passes through the pulmonary valve. So there you have the pulmonary valve and then the pulmonary artery. Okay? Now, after they go through the lungs, remember it goes back through the pulmonary veins. So you have right and left pulmonary veins. Okay? So you have the right and left. And they reach a chamber called the left atrium. After they reach the left atrium, it's pushed through a valve. Remember, this one's made up of two parts, so it's the bicuspid valve, or you can also call it the mitral valve. After it passes this valve between the left atrium and the left uh, ventricle, it reaches the left ventricle. Once blood is pushed out, it goes through the aorta. And here you can see again that it goes upwards. Okay, here you have it. Let me shadow it for you. These are the valves, the aortic valve, and the next step would be for the aorta. Now, think about it logically. Why do you think blood goes up first and then down? Your most important organ is your brain. So you want blood to reach your brain. So that's why this artery is upwards in order to push blood up your carotid arteries towards your brain, okay? And then it goes down to the rest of your body. So that's why it goes upward. Now, how does this work? Who actually controls the contraction and relaxing of the heart? And also, um, why does it do it? So, let's start by naming a few essential parts. The nerves of the heart start at a point called the sinus node. And as you can see in this image, the sinus node has branches that reach out to both atriums. So the atriums contract first, okay? And then that signal reaches back and stops for a very brief time, stops at the arioventricular node. So the atrial ventricular node, sorry. Why is it called atrial ventricular node? Well, as you can see, it's in the middle of the atriums and the ventricles. So that's why it's called atrial ventricular node. Quite easy to remember. It stops here in order to for the valves. Some valves, as you can see, have to open. Some valves have to close. So this node allows sufficient time for these valves to change. Okay. Once they change, it sends a signal along to the next part that has to contract, which are the ventricles. The ventricles then contract and push blood out the arteries. Remember, when the blood goes out, it's an artery. So there, as you can see, there are two contractions. The top part, which are the ventricles, then the atriums, then the bottom part, which are the ventricles. So when the ventricles or atriums contract, this is called systole. Okay, it's right here, systole. And when the heart relaxes, it actually relaxes all four chambers at the same time, and this is called diastole. And during this period, blood goes in all four chambers. So you might ask yourselves, why does it contract in two steps and then fill up in one? Well, in reality, what we do when we fill up all the heart, we don't have a lot of pressure. So what the heart does, is squeeze the first part first, creating an even greater pressure within the ventricles. And once this greater pressure is in there, it then contracts uh, and makes the pressure even bigger. So this pressure is very important because if not, it couldn't reach all our body. If we would just let's say blood pass without the atriums, then our pressure would be so low that there would be even positions, maybe even standing up, we would faint because the blood wouldn't reach our brain. Okay, so there's once again 3 steps to to heart contraction and relaxing. First systole, second systole, and then the diastole. Okay? One of the most important, or actually the most deadly diseases in our time today is cholesterol. But we're a bit confused about what they cause. Okay, we use these two terms, arteriosclerosis and atherosclerosis, very similar because they sound alike, but they're although they're similar, they have a very subtle difference. Both are have to do with clogging of the arteries. Okay, but the difference is how. Okay, so when cholesterol accumulates between the lining, the inner tubing of an artery or a vein, and the outer tubing. So actually, your blood vessels are made up of 2 layers, one tube with inside the other. When this cholesterol accumulates in there and makes it so small that blood can't pass, this is called atherosclerosis. But when you have other substances that accumulate inside the the blood vessel where the actual blood flows, then it's sclerosis. Okay, atherosclerosis. Hope that you understood. As always, if you have any doubts, please don't doubt in asking.